everyone, my name is Lauren Helton. I'm a staff biologist and scientific illustrator with the Institute for Bird Populations. And today we're going to do sort of a basic introductory video on how to translate the MAPS codes that you might be taking down on your data sheets into WRP codes. So I'm sure you've noticed, of course, there's a lot of talk about WRP. WRP is easy. It's intimidating at first, I think, when you're used to an older, the older system. You may know stuff like hatch year and second year birds, all the sorts of things you're used to writing on your data sheets. But the reason I have this kingfisher here that I've drawn telling you WRP is easy is because when I've worked with groups in other locations in the tropics where they're first learning bird banding, we teach them WRP to start with, and then we go back and make mention of the system that you might be more familiar with. And that system to them is confusing. They're like, oh, why don't they just use WRP? WRP is easy. So erase what you know about the old system for a little bit and just get into this mindset that as long as you understand bird molts, there's nothing difficult or complicated about WRP. It's just different. So we'll run through it and hopefully clear up some of those differences so that you understand why it is easy. I'm going to briefly take you first through the life of a typical migratory songbird. Now, we all know that there are tons of exceptions to this, but the basics here should help you. First remind you what the old system is. I know, I'm sorry, I just told you to forget it, but we're going to refresh our memory on how the old system works, and then we're going to go into how you like with the WRP labels for those things. So first off, of course, if you've got a hatchier bird, sometime in spring, that bird we're calling Joe leaves the nest, grows, its juvenile plumage, does the pre-formative molt, which yields formative plumage. And so formative plumage has this combination of formative and juvenile feathers, the formative body feathers and the juvenile flight feathers. And then they migrate down to the tropics. So then suddenly in the second year, that we're calling this second year because it's the second calendar year, right? And that's the thing about WRP is you don't have to worry about like which calendar year you're in. There's no arbitrary change of, oh, this bird's the second year now because January 1st passed. We're not worrying about that when we're talking about WRP. So this bird in formative plumage comes through. He might do a pre-alternate molt, which is typically just some head feathers. In this alternate plumage now, he or she breeds, and then after the breeding season, typically they do that pre-basic molt, which in most songbirds is now a complete molt. So this includes the flight feathers also. And at this point, this is when, let me draw a little line here. This is when you might start to call these birds after hatch year at this point using that prior system. Because again, if you can see that this second year and after second year bird look the same at that point. So based on dates, you change the name of the bird's age. And that's another thing you don't have to worry about with WRP. So it goes through that end of that second year and this basic plumage comes through, might do another pre-alternate molt in spring after the second year, breeds pre-basic molt, and so on and so forth. All right, let me erase my little additions here real quick. All right, so let's go through this now using WRP codes. Actually, first, when Joe fledges, he's actually doing this first pre-juvenile molt. Write that in real quick. So again, remember, if you've seen previous videos, and if you haven't, you should probably go back and sort of refresh your memory, maybe do some reading up on the basics of WRP. But the idea is that there's these three letters that make up the code, right? So the first letter, F in this case, tells you what cycle you're in. So this is the bird's first plumage cycle. The P or C, whatever is in the middle, is whether he's molting or not. And then the last letter is the actual plumage that he's in. So if he's fledging doing a first pre-juvenile molt, then you just use his first cycle pre-juvenile, FPJ. Once he's done with that, his first cycle juvenile, no longer pre anything. But pretty quickly he's going to do a pre-formative molt. So we're again in the first cycle, and he's doing a pre-formative molt. It's just written just like it is. Alright, so now having completed that, he is in first cycle formative plumage, migrates, still in first cycle formative plumage down here in the second year, because the second year thing doesn't matter at all. The plumage is exactly the same. He will do a first cycle pre-alternate molt in spring. So we still know this bird is first cycle because there are still juvenile feathers remaining on the body somewhere, in this case, and then all these flight feathers. The pre-alternate molt results in first cycle alternate plumage. So this is only for birds that have, again, a pre-alternate molt and alternate plumage. There's going to be tons of exceptions, but this is just to give you an idea of when these things happen. So a first cycle alternate bird will look a lot like a first cycle formative bird in most cases, because a lot of our songbirds, their alternate plumage is not super obvious, but I'm sure you can think of exceptions. Then he goes through his first actual pre-basic molt, and so he's entering his second cycle now. That's why we have an S now. He's losing these juvenile feathers going into the second plumage cycle, and this is a pre-basic molt. Now, this S, in this case, in most of your songbirds, you're going to lose really, really quickly, because once he's replaced all of his feathers, all body feathers and all flight feathers, and has nothing remaining that's any trace of any first or otherwise, early molt cycle, that's when we switch to a D. So definitive means for the rest of all time, he's going to be in the same type of plumage cycle, a definitive plumage cycle. So it doesn't matter, if he's 2, 3, 4, however many years old. So we just use this S to indicate second cycle back when we can see that there is a second cycle he's going into, but pretty soon after we can't tell anymore. Okay, so he migrates all the way through December, through January. He's still in definitive cycle basic plumage. In spring he does another pre-alternate molt. Again, this time he's in his definitive plumage cycle. So he's doing a pre-alternate molt there. Goes into definitive cycle alternate plumage. And then now, because these two are different now, because, right, we don't have an S anymore because there's no juvenile feathers, we can't tell that this is a second cycle. He's just in this definitive cycle doing another pre-basic, and he goes straight back into definitive cycle basic. That's a quick overview. If at any point you want to pause, replay, go through this again to refresh your memory, that's great. There are also adjunct codes coming in that I'm not going to talk about a whole lot in this video, but the idea is that you might be able to use them to indicate whether, for example, if a bird is a young formative versus an older formative bird, but I'm not going to worry about that right now. This is how these 3-letter codes work. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and move on to a couple of specific examples, and the idea here is I've got something that's kind of like a data sheet. It's got some of your usual columns you might use on your maps data sheets. It's missing a few because I'm mostly just going to be talking about plumage here, molt limits and plumage codes, and how to use those to, how to translate those into WRP. I don't have skull, I don't have brood patch, those are other things you would be able to use, but we're just looking specifically at plumages here in this case. And I do want to point out, before I go ahead with our examples, that all of the photos are taken from this cool website down here called Piranga. I highly recommend you go check it out if you haven't before. If you're familiar with eBird and the Macaulay Library being just this big database of photos of birds from around the world for birders, this is like that, but for bird banders more specifically. It's got open wing and tail photos, and it discusses, the ages of the birds in those photos. And so it's a really nice reference for if you just want to study up and know what to look for certain species at different ages. So with that said, what I'll do here is we're going to process this bird based on the photos, and I will write down what we see, and then we'll use that to work our way backwards to the age, just like you always would. except that we're going to code it as WRP codes. If at any point you want to pause and work out for yourself, what you think you're seeing or how you think you would write it down, go for it. That's the big advantage of a pre-recorded video like this, is it gives you all the time you want to sort of work through it at your own pace. All right, so with that said, this is a Swainson's thrush, tells you right there. We're not having to identify birds in this, there's that at least. So here we have a Swainson's thrush, and the date for this bird, I don't remember off the top of my head when these photos were taken, but let's say that we get this bird sometime kind of late in your maps season. July, I don't know, 20, sure, that's a date. All right, so July 20th, you catch a Swainson's thrush that looks like this. You have a look at this bird and you're trying to work out what you want to write down. The first thing I have here that we are going to write down is, before you get to those molt limits and plumage codes, we need to know if the bird is actively molting or not, because remember, that's important for that middle WRP letter. So this bird is not molting. And remember too, this is a good thing to check on your data sheets just in general, is a lot of people will accidentally write a 0 here when they mean an N, so flight feather molt is always a letter. So not molting. All right, primary coverts. These primary coverts are maybe a little hard to see in the photo. You can lean way up close to your monitor and have a real good close look at them. But they're narrow, they're tapered, they're brown, they're braided, they're not in great shape. They're not terrible, they're not trashed, but they're not as sort of high quality, dusky, nicer feathers that you might see in older birds. So these primary coverts, we're going to say, are probably juvenile. These secondary coverts, so if you're familiar with Swainson's thrush, you'll notice that we have 2 different feather generations in this tract. So the retained juvenile feathers are browner, more frayed. A lot of them have these little buffy or whitish tips on the ends of them, like you can see there. You can also see some of those in the median coverts too. We'll get there in a second. But there are at least a couple feathers at the very inside of this tract that have been replaced. They don't have those buffy tips. They look sort of a nice glossy olive greenish color to them. So we have a molt limit in the secondary coverts. The primaries, unfortunately, this photo has cut them off. But if you think back to Joe Bird, you can kind of know what to expect, right? Is that this bird probably hasn't replaced its flight feathers yet. It certainly hasn't replaced the primary coverts, and in this species, like many, they replace primary coverts and primaries at the same time during a molt. So we can also see that, while these inner ones are never super easy to tell whether they're tapered or not, they are pretty translucent. They're not nice and dusky. The shafts, the rachis on each one, already looks a little bit tinted brown. So these primaries are going to be juvenile. The secondaries are a little bit clearer. If you've ever seen basic secondaries on a Swainson's thrush, they're like a huge, chunky, nice rectangle, and these are a little bit narrower. They're definitely tapered. They're definitely frayed. So those are juvenile secondaries. Unfortunately, we can't really see the tertials. They've been cut off, so we're going to have to leave that blank for this bird. And that's also sometimes common. Those tertials get really sun damaged, and they can be hard to judge sometimes anyway. So I see a lot of blank tertials on data sheets. That's fine. Retrices are a little bit easier. These are really tapered. They're really rough, really translucent, pretty poor quality feathers, which means that they are juvenile. And then if you feel like it, you don't have to write down body plumage for every single bird, but since we've got these nice obvious buffy tips in the median coverts that I pointed out a second ago, while some of them have them, but some of them are just these, oh, I changed colors, that's fine. Some of them are just these nice green olivey ones without the buffy tips, so if you wanted to, you could say there's a limit in the body plumage as well. So how would we code this in WRP? Well, if you, again, think back to Joe Bird, This combination of juvenile flight feathers and formative or limit in the body feathers, that means that this bird's in formative plumage. So it's in its first cycle, because we know that the preformative molt, formative plumage are first cycle plumages. There are still juvenile feathers remaining in the tract, if that helps you too. This bird is not currently molting, right? So the middle code is going to be a C. It cannot be a P. It is not molting. It is in a cycle of some sort. And we've said the third letter already. This bird is in formative plumage, so it is in first cycle formative plumage. And how did we age that bird? Based on the limit. So we've got multiple feather generations, both within tracts, like in the secondary coverts, and then between tracts, like between the primary and secondary coverts. So that means that we have molt limits. Now, if you really wanted to assign an old style age to this bird, in the hand, you would also probably be able to look and see that it doesn't have a bird patch or a CP. It probably has like an incomplete skull of some sort. This date, by late July, probably a second year bird would be a lot more roughed up or would already have started molting. So in any case, this bird is a hatch year. And if you wanted to, I'll make brief mention of these adjunct codes that I just hinted at a second ago. In cases where you really want to be sure that you're denoting whether a bird is a hatch year or a second year, if you're like, yeah, it's in formative plumage. So in this case, if you wanted to use an adjunct code, you could use HFCF. So some of these boxes are actually not going to be just 3, there'll be 4. So H for hatch year. If this was, the next year around, you could say A. But anyway, FCF is the real important part. This is a first cycle formative bird. Okay, Swainson's thrush. Date on this one, again, we're going to pick a new month. We're going to call this June. June 6th. We've got 6/6 here. Okay. Is this bird currently molting? Does not look to be. Primary coverts. Oh, now these are different. These have, you see how even though they're still pretty narrow, again, because primary coverts are always a little bit narrow, they do have a bit of a broader, nice edge to them. They're also really dusky. You don't see through them as easily. They have kind of like a slaty sheen to them. I know that a lot of that is really hard to see from photos. Please trust me. If it helps, you can also look at the alula. I know I didn't point that out in the last bird. I'm actually going to go over to this left photo here because it's really nice and obvious. So this alula has like a really nice rounded curve to it. It was much pointier in those other birds. And again, if you also were able to look at P10, you might have noticed especially that first bird, you could see it, P10 came all the way out so that it was just about even with those primary coverts, whereas this one is much shorter. So those are all extra clues that would yield basic plumage. And actually, because we can't see the very tips of those primaries for the next one of the next boxes, then we can refer back to that P10. But real quick here, secondary coverts. So these are all uniform. There's no molt limit. They're all nice and gray. They have that dusky center. They're not transparent. So these are basic secondary coverts. The primaries, in addition to P10 being shorter, we can still see that the rachis is really like a nice solid jet black in these, and the feathers in general are not as transparent as those last ones. So we have basic primaries. The secondaries, well, a little harder to see with the bird's wing tilted away from us. They don't look as big and blocky as they would have, and we can leave those blank if you want, or if you can prefer, you can go ahead and put them down as basic because we kind of know they are. The secondaries we can actually see better. In this case, they're all that nice same slaty, like darker, dusky color with a bit of gloss as the rest of the feathers around them. And these retrices, so, they're a little bit brown, they're a little bit broken. These are ground-dwelling birds. They trash their feathers a bit more, but they have this nice broad sort of edge shape to some of them that you can see. They're not transparent. They don't have nice, like, easy visible lined up feathers or growth bars, I mean, on the feathers. All the bars are sort of staggered all over the place. So these retrices are probably also basic. And again, you don't have to write down every single thing. I'm writing them down because we've got time to look at them and see them. But if in the field all you were like, well, I've got to do these two and then let the bird go, that's fine. If it's got basic feathers anywhere, it's going to be in completely basic plumage, right? Because that's how, if you think back to Joe Bird, they do that pre-basic molt and replace everything. So every single feather is going to be basic. So, our WRP code. This bird only has, like, you don't really get additional cycles. Once they've gotten into the definitive cycle, which is, well, that's by definition, once they've started doing the definitive pre-basic and definitive cycle basic plumages, then they stay in that forever. So they're not complicated like a woodpecker or a dove that might have extra stages in between. This is just a definitive cycle basic bird. And we don't have to fuss with adjunct codes like A or H. This is an adult, so it's going to stay an adult for the rest of its life. How aged in this case? So we don't have a limit, we just have all uniform plumage. And in June, we could, if you wanted to think about the older codes, if it helps you at all, you could safely call this bird an after second year. But, you know, if you had written down after hatch year, that's fine too. In the sense, it doesn't matter because we know that it's in definitive cycle basic plumage. For WRP, that's the important part. It tells you, you know, this bird has gone through at least one pre-basic molt, and it is now in its definitive cycle. These birds do not have pre-alternate molts as far as we know. If they do, they're going to be like invisible to the average bander, so we don't have to worry about that either. Nice and simple. Okay, we've got a new species we're going to talk about here. So this is a common yellow throat. Hopefully you guys get to catch some of these where you're banding sometimes. In fact, probably if you caught this bird for the first time in your net, you'd be like, what the heck, how do I even know this is a common yellow throat? It doesn't look much like the older birds. So we kind of already know what age this bird is, but I'm going to walk you through how we write it down. Date, yeah, we're going to say, like, I don't know, June 2, sure. Might be earlier, might be later, depending on which location you're in, how far north you are, etc. Okay, so flight feather molt. This bird is molting flight feathers. Look at that. We've got some pins. And probably, if you had this bird in the hand, you would see that there would be some little pins stuck up underneath the secondaries as well. This bird is growing in its flight feathers for the very first time in its life. So we have a specific, and the tail obviously too, I should point that out. On the far right photo, the tail is, it's not grown in. It's a stub. So the flight feather molt code we use for this is J. This is juvenile growth. It's different from a symmetric molt where they're molting a couple feathers, you know, at a time, radially in sequence, however you want to think about it. These are all coming in at once. Juvenile growth. Primary coverts. I covered those up a little bit, my apologies. There you go. So they look nice and fresh and dusky, but that's just because they're brand new. They don't have the striking olive edging that a bird might have on its new basic primary coverts. These are just sort of dark grayish. Oops, sorry. I was just saying the word basic, and that's why I wrote that down. Okay. Juvenile. Secondary coverts. Alright, these are really frayed, dark, gray, brownish maybe. They don't look nice and green like on the older birds. Those are juvenile. Primaries, obviously juvenile. They're not even done coming in yet. Secondaries, same thing. Tertials, can't see them. Retrices, well boy, those are sure all juvenile. They're real pointy and they're not even there yet. Body plumage, 100% juvenile. In fact, you could put your shoe plumage column would be a 3. That's full juvenile plumage. Alright, WRP code. This bird is absolutely in its first cycle. You can't have a cycle before this. It's the youngest cycle there is. It is currently actively molting. So we don't have a C this time. We have a P. It is pre-something. And I've said it about 12 times here. It is doing its pre-juvenile molt. First pre-juvenile. How aged? Juvenile plumage is a good one to put for that. That's more specific than just plumage. And if you wanted to put the old age code, it would be a 2 for hatch year. Alright, the last one I'm going to do right now is another yellow throat. Date, it's the 4th of July. We're feeling very patriotic right now. Banding on 4th of July. As you should. Okay, so this bird is not molting. These primary coverts, they look a little bit worn, but you can see that they do have a higher quality barb density. They don't look transparent. They do have more of an olive wash on them. Secondary coverts are all uniform. They're pretty abraded. They're not too terrible. They definitely look green. Primaries are a little bit broader, a little bit, again, worn and brown just because this is a ground-dwelling bird, but we can tell looking at them they're not extremely transparent. They're all, they have a nice olive edge to the edge of the primaries. Same thing with those secondaries. Probably same thing with those tertials. So the rectrices, for a warbler, these are relatively truncate. Warblers have pointier tail feathers than the thrushes do, like in the previous Swainson's thrush example. Again, this is a ground-dwelling bird, like I just said, so they rough their tail up a little bit. And so in cases like this, you could look at this tail and go, well, it should be basic. But if you're not sure, you can leave it blank. I'm going to go ahead and write down basic. But again, if you leave columns blank, that's fine. For the interests of time when banding the bird, you don't necessarily want to look at every single detail. You want to just get enough to have the data covered that you're looking for. And then body plumage, same deal. Not going to worry about it. Now, this is where we need to be a little bit aware of the bird's life cycle here. So the initial reaction, I think, to seeing a whole bunch of bees like this is to just throw, oh, well, it's, whoops, oh, it's basic cycle basic, that's not a code. Definitive cycle basic. However, you need to look in your Peter Pyle's Identification Guide to North American Birds, because these guys can have a pre-alternate molt. It's usually going to be more obvious in the younger males. They might replace, a greater covert here, but they do have some amount of alternate head feathering coming in that can be really hard for a bander to identify. And so sometimes we do have to rely on the dates, in which case we would go ahead and call this bird a definitive cycle alternate plumage, because he's probably, spruced up his head feathers a little bit for the ladies. I don't know what I'm drawing here, little stars. He's very sparkly and pretty. To them, they see these nice glowing, feathers that are fresh. They might have like an ultraviolet sheen to them that we can't see. That would really make him stand out. If you put definitive cycle basic, definitely on the banding sheets, you would understand, and based on the date, you could look back and go, oh, okay, well, maybe it should be an alternate plumage instead, because it's something we can't see. So truly, this is a definitive cycle alternate bird. But that's the point of including this in here as an example is not to, like, hurt you. It's to make you realize that you do need to read the molt sections in the book to understand what time things are molting, because it may not be always obvious. Now, if you had a American goldfinch and he was bright yellow, then yes, obviously definitive cycle alternate. But it can be less obvious, and it's good to be aware of the dates. All right, how aged? Based on plumage, it's all uniform plumage. On July 4th, based on the amount of feather wear, and you could put feather wear in there also as a category if you wanted to. This is going to be an after second year bird. A bird that had somehow just finished a super early pre-basic molt wouldn't have quite such a ragged tail yet. But it doesn't matter, because he's still going to be, well, definitive cycle basic, I suppose, in that case. And that's why you need to pay attention to those dates. So that can be a little tricky, and that's something that you'll want to read up on and understand the timing of alternate molts in birds at your station. So I'm going to leave some weirdos for a later video, because there are more complicated codes that you'll need to understand. So next time we're going to discuss birds like brown creepers that have a complete preformative molt, and so coding them might be different. And we'll also take a look at birds like woodpeckers or doves that have multiple plumage cycles beyond just first cycle and then suddenly definitive. So we'll get practice using those. If you haven't gone and watched Peter Pyle and Ramiro Aragon's video on the use of WRP in the tropics, I highly recommend it. It's long, but it'll teach you a whole lot about the WRP system in depth, and you know, might help practice your Spanish if you're not up on Spanish yet, or maybe it'll help you practice your bird terminology in English too. Who knows? All right, thanks everyone.